Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, it's a really common question in social science research, isn't it? How many interviews are actually enough?
It is, and if you've asked that, you've probably heard the classic answer, it depends. Which is true, but also incredibly frustrating.
Exactly. So, our mission today is to unpack that it depends. What does it depend on? We want to give you some real clarity on navigating this.
And we're leaning heavily on a great review paper for this, Sample Size for Interview and Qualitative Research in Social Sciences, a guide to novice researchers.
It really tries to cut through the confusion, especially for, people starting out, or really anyone grappling with this.
Okay, let's dive in then. The fundamental issue, and this is where it differs so much from quantitative studies, is that saying, I need X number of interviews before you start. Well, it's just really tricky in qualitative work.
It really is. A lot of that comes down to how we sample. We mostly use something called purposive sampling.
Right, purposive. So not random like in some big surveys. Exactly. It's strategic. You're deliberately picking people because their specific experiences or insights are vital to your research question. You know who you need to talk to.
Which sounds powerful.
It is very powerful for getting deep insights, but that very freedom, that strategic choice, makes it hard to just, pull a number out of thin air beforehand.
And that leads us to this idea of theoretical saturation, right? The point where you're just not hearing anything new. Sounds ideal, but how do you actually know when you've hit it? Seems like a practical nightmare.
Oh, it's a huge challenge because you can really only tell if you've reached saturation while you're actively collecting and analyzing the data. It's iterative.
Okay, so you collect some, analyze, see if new themes are emerging.
Precisely, which you can imagine creates a real problem for planning, especially when you need funding, right? Grant proposals demand a clear plan, a budget.
They want a number up front.
They do. And if the right number only kind of reveals itself during the study, well, how do you justify that initial number? It's a well-known tension.
So we've established it depends. Deeply unsatisfying on its own. But now for the good part. What does it depend on? What are the key things researchers need to think about? I know Morse did a lot of work on this.
Yes. Morse laid out some really helpful factors, sort of a checklist. You've got to think about the scope of your study. How broad is it? Then the nature of the topic itself it's sensitive, complex.
Okay, scope, topic.
Then the quality you expect from the data. The specific study design you're using makes a difference, too. The researcher's own experience plays a role.
Your own experience. Interesting.
Yeah. And then the practical things, of course. Budget and time. You can't ignore those.
That's quite a list. It really shows it's not just one thing. So let's maybe break a few of those down. Where should we start? How about the sample itself, like who you're talking to?
Good place to start. The composition of the sample, basically how similar or different your participants are, that's crucial. Homogeneity versus heterogeneity.
Okay, so if everyone's kind of similar versus a really mixed group.
Exactly. If your sample is very diverse, say, people from different countries or different levels in an organization, wildly different backgrounds, you'll almost certainly need a larger sample to feel confident you've captured those varied perspectives and reached saturation across them.
That makes immediate sense. Like, if you're comparing men and women or different age groups, you need enough from each group, not just a total number.
Precisely. More comparisons generally mean more interviews needed. Then there's the scope we mentioned.
Right, how big the project is overall.
Yeah. If you're trying to answer a really broad question, exploring lots of different facets, you're naturally going to need more participants, probably more interviews per participant, maybe even different types of data to really cover it all.
So the wider you cast your net, question-wise, the more fish or interviews you'll likely need to pull in.
Yeah.
A good rule of thumb.
Definitely. And linked to that is the nature of the topic itself.
You mentioned sensitivity or complexity.
If it's a topic people find difficult to talk about, or maybe it's really new and uncharted territory, or the information just isn't easily accessible, you'll likely need more participants to piece together a full picture.
Compared to something more straightforward.
Right. If it's something easily observed or discussed, you might get there faster, needing fewer interviews. Also, if participants are maybe less cooperative or less able to articulate things clearly,
then you naturally need to talk to more people to compensate. Makes sense.
And that ties into the next factor, the actual quality of the data you're getting.
So this depends a lot on the participants themselves.
It really does. Some people are just naturally more articulate, or they have incredibly rich, relevant experiences they can share clearly. If your participants are providing really dense, insightful, on-target information, less droth, as Morse puts it.
That's waffle.
Kind of, yeah. Then you might find you reach saturation with fewer interviews because each one is just packed with value.
So finding those really insightful participants can actually mean you might need a slightly smaller sample overall. That's a potential upside.
It can be, yes. Quality over just quantity, in a sense.
Okay, this is incredibly helpful for understanding the why behind it depends. But let's get to the part everyone secretly wants to know, the numbers. Even though there's no magic bullet, what kind of ranges do scholars suggest, especially for different types of qualitative studies?
Right, the numbers. They definitely vary by design. So for narrative research, where you're often focusing intensely on one person's life story, maybe how they make sense of things, you're typically looking at just like one or two individuals.
Wow, really? Just one or two?
Yeah, because the depth comes from that really intensive focus on a single case or maybe two contrasting ones.
Okay. What about phenomenology? That's about shared experiences, right?
Exactly. Understanding the essence of a lived experience across people, their suggestions are often for a smaller group. Morse suggested at least 6, Creswell maybe 5 to 25. You need enough people to see the common threads of that experience.
Makes sense. Then you have things like ethnography. That sounds like it needs more people.
It usually does.
Yeah.
Ethnography involves immersing yourself in a whole cultural group or community setting. You're observing, participating, trying to understand the whole picture. So yeah, numbers like 30 to 50 participants, even 30 to 60 are often mentioned. You need that breadth to understand a culture.
Right. You're looking at a whole system. And grounded theory, where you're building theory from the data.
Similar sort of range often. Morse suggested around 30 to 50, Creswell maybe 20 to 30. Because you're constantly comparing data, developing categories, refining theory, you need a decent amount of data from enough people for that field to be, well, grounded.
Those design-specific numbers are useful benchmarks. But are there any more general guidelines for just, a qualitative interview study?
There are some broader suggestions floating around. Bernard suggested maybe 10 to 20 key participants could be enough to uncover the major issues in many studies. Berthaud, way back, called 15 the smallest acceptable size.
15, okay.
And then there's a really interesting finding from Guest and his colleagues in 2006. They actually found that sometimes as few as 6 to 12 interviews can be enough. But, and this is a big but.
There's always a catch.
Yeah.
What's the catch with 6 to 12? Wouldn't that definitely not be enough?
The key is homogeneity. That small number, 6 to 12, really only holds up if your sample group is very, very similar, like incredibly uniform, and your main goal is just to understand the common perceptions or experiences within that specific narrow group.
So if your group is diverse,
then 6 to 12 is almost certainly not enough. Or if the data you're getting turns out to be, not very rich, or if the topic is really complex, and especially if you want to compare different subgroups or look for variations, forget it. You'll need more.
that's a really important clarification. That 6 to 12 idea sounds appealingly small, but it comes with major strings attached.
Huge strings, yes. It's context dependent.
Okay, this leads to another real-world factor. Publishing. Let's be honest. Researchers want to get their work out there. Does the publishing world have its own, maybe unspoken expectations about sample size?
It's an interesting point. There is an observation mentioned by Bryman that suggests for many qualitative interview studies to get published, reviewers often seem to expect something in the range of, say, 20 to 30 interviews minimum.
20 to 30 seems to be a common zone then.
It appears that way, anecdotally at least, though narrative research is the big exception, where 1 or 2 is perfectly fine and publishable because of the design.
But even there's disagreement, right?
Yeah.
I remember seeing some quite strong opinions.
Oh, absolutely. You have folks like Gerson and Horowitz who argued pretty forcefully that anything less than 60 interviews just can't support convincing conclusions.
60. Wow. That's a high bar.
It is. And then they also warned against going too big, saying more than 150 interviews becomes almost impossible to analyze properly, deeply and efficiently.
So they're saying there's a kind of sweet spot, but it's quite large, like 60 to 150. That contradicts the 20-30 idea.
It does, and it just underscores that there's no universal consensus on minimums or maximums. What most do agree on is the underlying principle. Not so small that you can't reach saturation and really understand the phenomenon,
Right.
but not so large that you're just overwhelmed by data and can't do a thorough, deep analysis, which is arguably the whole point of qualitative research.
And is there a sense that journals maybe favor larger samples sometimes.
There's perhaps a tendency for studies with larger, maybe more diverse samples to get into top journals, possibly because they seem to offer broader generalizability or more robust findings across different groups. But again, it's not a hard rule.
Okay, so we've come full circle back to it depends. But
Yeah.
hopefully now that phrase feels less like a dismissal and more like an invitation to think critically.
Exactly. It depends on the sample composition, the scope, the topic, the data quality, the design, all those things we discussed.
It's about making a conscious, informed choice based on your specific research context.
Precisely. And I think the best takeaway, really echoing Bryman, is this. Stop worrying so much about hitting someone else's magic number. Focus instead on being really clear and confident in justifying your sampling approach. Why this method? Why these participants? And crucially, why is the sample size appropriate for achieving your research goals?
That emphasis on justification feels much more empowering than just searching for a number.
It is. It's about the rationale, the transparency, the fit between your question and your method.
So a final thought then, perhaps for you listening. We've seen there's no single right number in research sampling. It's about context and justification. How might that idea apply more broadly? When you're trying to understand anything, maybe a complex issue in the news, a new skill, even just deciding if you've heard enough viewpoints on something, how do you decide what's enough information to feel genuinely well-informed? Something to chew on until our next deep dive.